I'm Tim Henning, your co-host tonight, along with Ike Ellis. Tonight, our incredible speaker, Daniel Marsh-Patrick. He is the founder and principal consultant at Coacervo. Hopefully I said that correctly, Daniel.
That's pretty close, yeah.
Pretty close. I didn't butcher it too much. And he is a data platform Microsoft MVP, so he's well-renowned. And so for those of you who are looking to go beyond the native Power BI core visuals, this is going to be a fantastic presentation. So the official title is Deneb, Declarative Visualization in Power BI. And with that, take it away, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thanks to Ike as well for having me. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll just share my screen. And we did a quick test beforehand, but hopefully, Tim, you can just confirm that it's coming through okay.
It is.
Lovely. Yep. So indeed, the title of the session is Deneb, Declarative Visualization in Power BI. So to just expand upon Tim's intro, yep, I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and there's some places you can find me online if you want to get in touch. A little bit about my background. So I've done a little bit in my career, but I've been working in BI and particularly with Microsoft Power BI now for a long time, about 10 years now, I think. And I used to do the whole gamut of BI. So I would architect and manage projects all the way through from conception to continuing ongoing maintenance. One of the things I gradually got frustrated with in Power BI was the visualization side of things. So I gradually have gravitated towards developing custom visuals, and I release those to app source and make them available for free, and they're open source as well. So that means that you're able to go look at the source code and learn how to do it yourself. The visuals I release down at the bottom here. So started with the small multiple line chart, which was to get around the fact that at the time visuals didn't have what we call small multiples. Fortunately, core visuals do. A lot of them have that now. So that one's a little by the wayside, but it's kind of gradually moved me into a very fun and exciting domain for me. So the violin plot was the next one. And these are all certified as well by Microsoft. HTML content it's another visual that I release, which just allows people to dynamically render content inside Power BI. And that led a lot towards building Deneb, which we'll talk about a little bit throughout the session. So in terms of what we'll do today, we'll talk a little bit about the visualization options in Power BI. We'll talk about the tooling, obviously. We'll talk about how we need to really think with approaching these tools. We'll do a short demo, and as I was saying, Tim, if time allows, we can maybe just go a little bit further with that. We'll see how we go, and we'll talk about further resources. I have sort of made time for Q&A, but as I said to Tim, I'm happy for him to field questions throughout, depending on what comes up. So I think the key thing really is for a lot of us that, particularly down in the Asia Pacific region, our companies tend to be a bit smaller. So we generally tend to have people that have responsibility for the full BI life cycle. But I think a lot of you that have worked in this domain can perhaps appreciate that with big projects, a lot of the time goes towards the data cleansing, the modeling, the transformation, all those kind of things that need to be done to make a model consumable and workable at the front end. And this stuff is, it's complex work, but it's not visible work. And what that means is that you could be spending weeks, months, possibly, sometimes years, depending on the size of your organization, building the perfect model pipeline, clean data before it even gets seen. And that's hard to communicate to the business. The business don't really understand. Some do, but most don't appreciate that work. It's your job, and you are proud of it. And the best way I have personally found to show that off is in the visualization layer. The challenges with a lot of these projects, visualization kind of falls at the end, or people perhaps don't appreciate the amount of effort it can take to build a good communicative report. But ultimately, we are at the mercy of what's available. Now, if we think about Power BI as a tool, not necessarily enterprise grade things like Data Factory and SQL Server and various other things, but if we're building transformations in Power BI, we have Power Query, and Power Query is a nice visual interface with drag and drop data transforms. It's very powerful, but at the same time, if you need to go deeper, if you want to take the range yourself or optimize things, there's a language called M that sits underneath. You can actually edit the query behind it. You can, if you know better or you want to optimize, you can do that, which is great. And with data modeling in Power BI, we have another language called DAX, which allows us to tweak and tune measures to our liking, to our business logic, and that's very, very powerful as well. And there are people globally that are incredibly, profoundly amazing in that domain. With visuals, it's a little bit trickier. You generally have, as I say, what's available. There are some options there, but there's no easy way to kind of take a visual and do what you could do with M or DAX. I mean, technically there is. And we'll talk a little bit about visualization options in Power BI out of the box. So what we're looking at here is on a scale of easy to kind of very hard and a lot of effort to invest. Power BI gives you kind of 4 options out of the box. We've got the ability to add visuals from the palette over here. Now, these may be core visuals, or they may be custom visuals that vendors develop, vendors like me develop and make available for you. Or you could build your own internally. To do that, you need to use the hardest component over here. So this is something Microsoft makes available. This is the closest thing we have out of the box to the M or DAX scenarios that I was talking about. So they make available what's called a software development kit, or SDK. And that's kind of like a bridge between web development technologies like JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and Power BI's own workings. And if you know how to do web development, or if you have people that do, you can build a custom visual, and you can basically make it importable for other people or choosable. So that's kind of out of the box type options, I guess. In terms of other things you can do modeling. So you can use DAX creatively. You can use things like calculation groups to bend the visuals a bit more to your will. Or if you have knowledge in the R and or Python domain, Microsoft make R and Python visuals available. So if you know how to use those languages, that's great. The challenge with the R and Python visuals is they don't work in scenarios like publish to web or mobile. They don't export to PDFs or PowerPoint presentations. They're dependent on the libraries you have installed on your machine when you're developing, but also when you publish to the Power BI service, they're dependent on what libraries Microsoft make available. The compute resource is flexible sometimes if you're on Pro. Visuals might take a long time to render. Your users may see a latency in that, and the visual comes back as a static image, which means that it's not interactive. So the kind of things that people expect out of Power BI, whilst you've got a way in if you have those skills, which are great because you can port those into Power BI, they just don't give you everything you might want. And a lot of us might start here and become frustrated. We may have enough, but oftentimes we start to have to look over this side, and then it becomes quite a big sort of learning ramp, essentially. When, if you don't know web development, you have to learn it, but it's also the building, the compilation, and numerous other things. It can get quite complicated. So in terms of other things you can do, we're getting into the concept of custom visuals now. And there's at last check.
I had a quick question, Daniel.
Yes.
Would you say it's easier for a Power BI professional to learn the Visual SDK and create custom visuals? Or would you say it's easier for a web developer to learn what they need to know about Power BI and create a visual from the SDK? Which direction do you think is the easiest path?
The easiest path is if you have access to both. I think if you have someone that already knows JavaScript and web development and somebody that knows Power BI, that's probably the ultimate harmony, because Power BI has quirks and things that if you're a web developer, you don't necessarily have that domain knowledge, and you have to find that stuff out. So oftentimes I work with developers who are very, very skilled and can knock something up really quickly. But when it comes to how Power BI talks to visuals, that's where it becomes a problem. And that's generally where you need the domain expertise. So I'd say if you've got one person as a Power BI developer, if you're adaptable for learning, it can be fun and rewarding to learn web development, but it can also be a big step up. And often when you've got a project looming, that's time you can't, accommodate. So ideally, if you know someone that's skilled in web development and you know Power BI, that's probably going to be the most harmonious thing and probably the path of least resistance using the SDK. The ideal
other
outcome is you have all the time you need to do it. But that's not always true.
The other question I have is, Power BI custom visuals have been out so long, and the marketplace is plentiful. Are there still, do you personally still have visual ideas that haven't been developed yet, where you're like, oh, I bet that visual will be popular or valuable, or there'll be customers that want it?
Yes, and maybe. I have lots of ideas. The question is whether they're, viable in the market. Often I get approached by people to build one specific visual, and that's great for their use case. And that's where you run into challenges with custom visuals and core visuals too, is that they are designed by developers who believe you things should work a certain way, which in some cases is fine. Often you want to be able to just say this is a visual that does one thing very, very well. Other times you get stuck with limitations. So, a lot of us are doing these things in the right-hand side because we don't find what we want. So there is always the possibility, but I think everybody's use case is always a little bit different. And it's hard to tell without doing extensive kind of market research what's going to work. So I think some vendors are doing very well at finding those gaps and making them and marketing them and continuing to develop them. I think if you're starting out, it can be quite hard. Often what happens is visuals tend to be built because one person needs something done a particular way. And then there could be options to make it more widely available and commercialize it. But it really depends. But yes, I have quite a few ideas on my personal backlog. I do have to work out whether they may be successful or not. I've been quite lucky that the 5 I do in AppSource do quite well. I think that's just because I've possibly got the cross-domain expertise where I've spent a lot of time in Power BI and I understand its limitations, and I'm able to find things that hit that sweet spot. But I think that can be quite a good advantage for the Power BI developer taking this approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. So on the subject that there are some custom visuals out of the pool of, I think at last check it was about 580 that are in there now, which is quite a large number. Synoptic Panel, Charticulator, Sandance, and PureVis are good examples of visuals that allow you to do something that's outside the constraints of a normal visual that does one specific thing. These are quite visual and they do have limitations, and sadly, Charticulator is a example of a really powerful visual, if anyone that's seen it, that sadly has been discontinued by Microsoft, which is a visual they were building to allow this kind of flexibility. The modeling side of things, where people are willing to spend an afternoon or two doing something in DAX to make a visual bend to its will, bend to their will, is an interesting learning. So as I say, I released a visual called HTML content, which I really saw a gap in terms of things like rich text and simple effects that people were missing from core visuals. But I found out from the community that people were building whole pages in it. They were building these incredibly rich experiences for their users. And when I talked to them about it, and I said, are you happy doing this? It seems awfully onerous. They said, yeah, this is exactly the kind of flexibility we want. So that gave me a lot of ideas, and that brings us to Deneb today, which we'll talk about. This kind of sits perhaps on the wrong side of the easy line for some, but the aim is to give you as much flexibility as possible within Power BI as an interface. So we talked about Deneb being a tool, but let's just explain why. So often with visuals, and we have covered this a little bit, you are choosing from a palette of predefined ideas. So, these are visuals people make available. These are visuals Microsoft make available. That ultimately, their usage is constrained by how they're developed and releases of those. So, we're seeing a lot of investment in the core visual, which is awesome. We weren't having so much until recently. So you want something doing, you're at the whim of somebody else. And a lot of tools like Power BI, they use the type of chart as somewhere to begin. So you have a preconceived idea of what you want to build. And if you want to build a bar chart, there are 6 types of bar chart, excluding the combo charts underneath. But you're picking a type of chart with a specific orientation. And these charts are basically rectangles on a page. They're just different ways, but they're discrete scenarios. You're kind of coming at it saying, this is the type of chart I need. But what about if I don't really know what chart I need and I want to explore my data a bit, or I want to prototype an idea with a client, or we need to go on a journey? Or what if bars aren't enough and we want to add extra things like lines or points or things like that, things in the scatter plot or line charts. Now, we do have analytics features in those visuals, but again, they are very specific to particular cases. And that's not to say people haven't found great uses for them. Error bars are a brilliant example in core visuals where people are overlaying things onto bar charts and line charts with great effect. But you are still constrained by that interface. And what if we want to control parts of the chart that we may not have access to? Developers make properties available in the properties pane. But again, if the property's not there, we may have to wait for them to code that in so that we can use it. So I like to think of things a different way. So with that paradigm, we take a chart we think we want. What if instead, if we've got an idea that we want to realize, we start with our data and build it upwards? So, when I was at school, it's a long time ago now, when I was a kid in math class, we did a lesson on making a chart, and we started with a piece of squared paper, and we used a ruler and a pencil, and we understood how to draw out our axes and draw out our bars on the page, which are basically rectangles. And we had to understand how to physically, what each square on the page meant, that kind of thing. This is what I think about with thinking visually. It's more about how I build a chart up from the ground rather than starting from the top and trying to hammer it into something that is what I want. So we talk about things like scales and marks and aesthetics. These are kind of components of the thing we're building. But what we really need is something that can join those together. It gives us the ability to kind of do that. And we can do that with code. And we call this imperative. And I think I'll just quickly share a different screen here. When we talk about that Visuals SDK, if we're building a visual using the toolkit, this is Microsoft's own sample bar chart example. This is one of the easiest charts you can build, with all the considerations, axis and property assignment and stuff like that. But if you want to learn how to do this, you can take this. But if you want to know how it works or build something else from scratch, I'm not going to focus on the actual what it does, but you have to do a lot of things to just make it work. This is, at last count, this is just one file from a project, but this is the main file. It's nearly 1,000 lines of code. And this is just to do simple things that you take for granted in Power BI. This is one of the biggest wake-up calls that, whilst it's something you can do, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get it working how you think it should work. That's the responsiveness, the interactivity, the properties, all these things add up. Instead, Deneb and the ideas I'm talking about today consider a different approach, which is known as a grammar of graphics, which we call declarative rather than imperative. So we'll talk about what that means. The grammar of graphics is a concept coined by Leland Wilkinson, who sadly is no longer with us, but has written an amazing book, which is quite thick, but very, very quite awesome on this subject. The idea is, whether we're coding a visual or using something simpler, this concept starts with this pipeline idea of different stages. So we start with our data and we gradually transform it through into things like scaling, applying statistics, coordinates on the page, and aesthetics, the kind of cosmetic elements. And these things don't know or care about the other parts of the pipeline, but it's done in such a way that it makes sense to, it's almost akin to drawing on a page. You kind of start with the data that you need to visualize, and you start to think about how you need to lay it out, and then you start to draw those things. But that's after you've hopefully gone through the thought process of how I'm going to lay it out. This is the same thought process. And this diagram is one diagram from the book, but it's quite a good distillation of what is quite a large read. But hopefully it will help us to establish what we're doing. And just sort of backtracking a little bit and covering the kind of things I was talking about, if we're thinking about imperative design, if we needed to build or code our own chart completely from the ground up, let's start with our data set. So this is just from my Power BI workbook. I've got a table with a categorical variable location, and I've got a measure which is aggregated by that. So just 5 lines. If I want to put that on a page, I've got to think about the visual container, which is what we see here. Now, Power BI, each visual has its own box, and that box is X pixels wide by Y pixels high. That is, physical dimensions on a screen. That is pixels. That is not necessarily the same as your data. So what we have to then think about with our coding and our instruction to the machine is we have to then encode or scale those values. So the Auckland, the Christchurch, the Hamilton, these are cities in New Zealand, by the way, for those in the Northern Hemisphere. We need to create space for those that are evenly distributed over the height of the visual. We're going to show this on our x-axis. And then with our temperature, which is a measure, that's going to go, sorry, we're going to show the location on the y-axis. We're going to show the temperature on the x-axis. And that's going to be a proportion of the width, because that's the way that we can read those linear measures. That works for us as, from a psychological perspective. But we have to then have code that takes that and works those things out. So what we've got here is space that we're reserving in our code to allocate those data items in the container. But people don't really understand those kind of things. So the next thing we will layer on top is some code to generate axes based on that scaling. And with our location, we have the discrete values. We only need those once because we've got 5 rows, but we need to know what city our data relates to. And with our temperature, this is a linear value. So we kind of choose an interval that makes a lot of sense. We don't have to put every number on there because that's overkill, but we need something that our brain can spot as a pattern. And this is things that we'll have to put in our logic. We have to understand the maximum of our data. We have to put sensible ranges on. We don't want to necessarily make these decimal places that aren't easy to read and quickly consume. And then finally, we will add what we call marks plus aesthetics. So these are things that actually become easier to understand. So we have to put in our code, how do we show the data? We might draw a rectangle on the page, and the length of that, the width of that rectangle is based on the measure and that scaling of logical to physical, and that lays it out on the page. And we do some additional styling of the grid, maybe just to make that a little more backgroundy, but the users can see now, based on the data set above, Auckland, this is New Zealand's biggest city, happens to have the highest average temperature in this data set. We might do more work to sort this to make it more intuitive, but you can see very quickly that that's how it kind of works. But a lot of stuff goes into that from a coding perspective to make it that simple. If instead we think about a grammar of graphics or declarative framework, what we might want to think about instead is, instead of writing hundreds of thousands of lines of code and spending a long time in there, let's think instead about something like we call it a specification. So you could think about it like a set of steps in Power Query where you're defining your transformations. They're very high level things, but they ultimately just describe what you want. And then what we want to do with that is, we can see our results, but then we can refine it. So we might get deeper into it, but we've got an ultimate approach that we can follow. So we might want to, if the bar doesn't work, we might want to see what happens if we change it to a different type. And what happens if we want to put more data fields in, or we want to, put in like an average line or something like that. How do we start to describe what we want? And that's what the grammar of graphics helps us to do. The problem with grammar graphics is the tools take a lot of development and research to implement. So a good example of that would be Tableau, which is a competitor to Power BI in terms of the visualization space, getting there with the data space. But it's known as a very, very powerful visualization engine, and that's because it thinks a little bit differently to Power BI. It actually does, rows and columns and encodings, where you're binding attributes of your data to these things, which is very visual and very easy to prototype. But these can still be subject to constraints. So Tableau is a UI, it's very powerful, but ultimately features still have to be added in. And sometimes you can hit roadblocks that are dependent on that. So instead of a UI, try and find a middle ground. So instead of full code, what I quite like is, and we're data professionals, so a lot of us have worked with the construct of JSON, which is a way of storing and transporting data across the internet, but also a way of kind of storing things perhaps internally. It's not exactly the most efficient way to do it, but it's very, very human readable. And there's an example here that just sort of shows the way JSON might work, but it's very easy for you as a human to read information about me and understand it, but a machine can also do that. And it's a nice middle ground between the two parties. So we can see that there are, we have keys that dictate what a field is called. We have values that are used to assign to those keys. So, it's Daniel, I live in New Zealand. We've got data types, so we've got text, we've got numbers, we have repeating elements called arrays, which use the square brackets, and we can have 0 to many things in there. We can also structure more complex objects inside arrays. So we can have our own objects of key value pairs and do other things. So this is quite useful. But what we also have, because it's quite flexible, we have the concept of what's called a JSON schema, which is to allow you to provide structure to this format. And we can think of a schema as a kind of language. And that's where tools like Vega and Vega-Lite come in. So Vega and Vega-Lite are grammars of graphics. They are built by the University of Washington Interactive Data Lab, which is a very prodigious place for data visualization research. Vega and Vega-Lite are into their 5th major version. They're continually developed and maintained by the alumni and the community. And you use JSON to build these specifications that we're talking about. Let's start with Vega. So each has their own website, but Vega is a way of using JSON to do this declarative stuff we're talking about. I won't dwell too much on the how and the why, because it is a little more complex. Vega-Lite will be what we'll focus on today, but we can go to the Vega website, we can look through their documentation. We can already see on the page that there are some examples. I can click on the examples page, and I can see that they've provided quite a lot. And we can see already there's a lot of visual types that we may not have seen in Power BI, and including Pac-Man, because why not? But if we were to look at something like a bar chart, let's just make this a little bit bigger. Instead of using code, we use JSON. And we can see we've got key value pairs. We've got the schema that says we're using Vega's language. But we've got attributes like width and height, padding, things that we might understand a bit more, our data. And then we have the concept of scaling, axes, and marks. So these are things that we lay out and we say this is how things should work. And Vega's interpreter will build a visual based on that. Now, this is quite a lot of JSON, but it's still significantly better than 900 lines of code for something that's effectively the same thing. And you can build and prototype this much more quickly. So Vega is quite extensive. And Vega is, it sits on top of a library called D3, which if some of you have done web development will know is a JavaScript library that a lot of people do use, including Microsoft, to build visuals for the web. Vega-Lite is a version of Vega that has been refined and is easier to firstly get started with, and secondly, build very simple business use cases or common use cases with way less JSON. Similar structure, we can see some examples. And if we bring up the examples page, we can see that, again, we have the common kind of charts, the things that we take for granted but can build very easily. But as we scroll down, we can see things like diverging charts, histograms, density plots, 2D histograms, heat maps, isotype plots, all kinds of things, comet charts, stream graphs, pie charts and donut charts, waterfall charts, all kinds of things that we can maybe do a little bit more with. We can start to do complicated plots with layers. We've got faceting, we've got concatenation, we've got concepts that with visuals in Power BI, we might have to do things like layer them on top of each other, which has its own problems. We can do some interactivity. So there's a lot of things to get started. But if we go back to that bar chart example, just for comparison purposes, this is my Vega-Lite version. So instead of about 50 or 60 lines, we've got maybe 10, and the first 7 or so of those are really just concerned with data. So ultimately what we're saying is draw a bar mark and encode the X value to our field called A, which goes along the bottom, and our Y gets mapped to our field called B, which is our measure or quantitative value. But we can see that Vega-Lite, there's nothing else there, but it draws all the stuff we need. All the axes are taken care of, the scaling is taken care of. We can focus on our design. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a quick breather to take a little bit of a drink. I encourage Vega-Lite for people to begin with because it's much easier to get started. And as I say, we'll focus on that today. But in terms of Vega and Vega-Lite, this brings us to Deneb, which we are here to talk about. Deneb provides both Vega and Vega-Lite inside Power BI as a custom visual. And you will use JSON, just like we've seen. But what happens is the visual takes care of a lot of stuff that you would otherwise need to worry about as a visual developer. And it hosts both of those languages and encapsulates them. So everything is within the visual. So instead of like with the R and Python visuals, you need to have certain packages available. That's all included inside the visual. So that means it can run anywhere Power BI runs. It can run published to web. It can run in PowerPoint. It can run on mobile devices. Because it's also the same technology stack as Power BI visuals, it means that we can do things like interactivity, tooltips, cross-filtering, those kind of things. And then the other thing to think of is that it's also certified. So with custom visuals, you've got the option to go to Microsoft and get them certified, which gives them additional perks and benefits. But what it means is that when you build a custom visual with the SDK, if you're building that privately, you can't get that certified. You have to put it into app sources as a major prerequisite. So if you're building a visual for your company and you want it to be certified, you would have to make people aware that that visual exists by putting it in app source. And secondly, you have to go through a whole extra set of things to make sure it's compliant. And you have to do that for every release you submit. So the trick with Deneb here is Deneb does that for you so that anything you design gets the benefits. So if you build a bar chart like we just saw, it's going to export to PDF. It's going to run inside PowerPoint. And that's one of the attractive things as well. So we have websites for Vega and Vega-Lite. We also have a website for Deneb, which is hidden under my Teams toolbar. 1 second, you probably can't see that, but I can. Let's just, there we go. I have to do that. You need to use the keys. So the Deneb website, I write and maintain in conjunction with the custom visual. This explains all the things you need to think about with Power BI. We've got getting started, simple examples, how the data set works, how to do things like number formatting, how to do things like interactivity. We're going to cover a little bit of that today in our demo in just a second. But we've also got community and resources as well. So Deneb is a community tool. It is free and open source, which means that I have to dedicate my free time to maintaining it. But we have a community of people in our industry that are willing to share what they do. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But this is just so you're aware. There's further documentation if you need it to get started. We'll do a little demo today, which we will have a look at now. So I have a report page here. I've got a slicer. I've got a very simple model with locations. I've got a date table, and I've got some daily temperature readings from various cities in New Zealand. So we're going to do a little bit of New Zealand geography. I have Christchurch highlighted in my slicer, and on my map visual, we can see where that is. That's the nearest place to where I live. For those that are interested in New Zealand, I live kind of about here, just by the D of the South Island. But my city isn't covered in this data set. But we've also got a bar chart down here just to show the aggregation of average temperature by month. And because we're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's colder in the winter, which is June and July. And I know you're colder in the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, but it's usually December through February. This is just to start to give us some things to show how Deneb can work, but we've left a bit of space on the canvas here. And I've got Deneb added to my, hopefully the zoom will work here, to my visual palette, but I'll just show you that you can go to the Get More Visuals feature in Power BI if you want to get hold of this. So it's, as I say, it's published to App Source and certified, so it's available anywhere you're able to get to the App Store. Fortunately, it's an editor's pick right now, which is very handy for finding it. So it's right at the top, but you can search for it as well if you actually use the search bar instead of the drop down. So I can search for Deneb, I can search for Vega, and it will turn up. And I can add this just like any normal visual. So I might click on it and have a look. We've got a sample workbook that shows a little bit more. Hopefully they'll be able to show today. But we can add this to our report just like any other visual. So I've already done that, but just to show you where it is.
I'm sorry, Daniel. So
no, far away.
I'm a little slow. So the grammar of graphics is the intention of taking any data visual and having a mathematical method of displaying that data from the ground up. And then this community of people extrapolated on this idea and built these libraries and frameworks that port these concepts to different platforms. And then you developed a wrapper for some of these frameworks for Power BI that you wrote.
I think essentially that sums it up. But the grammar of graphics is more of a language for building visuals.
Okay.
So math can be involved, but it's more about this is how I wish to describe the visual to be built. So we'll walk through in just a sec. But yes, people took this concept and have developed various tools. So Vega and Vega-Lite are one. Tableau is another one. ggplot, if you've used R, is another one.
Yeah.
So those libraries are based on this premise. So instead of you focusing on the minutiae of, I've got to draw this pixel exactly right, and
it's basically giving
a
common taxonomy for
exactly
X and Y axes and values and lines and trends.
Yeah.
That where the vernacular is always the same regardless of the visual you're showing.
Yes.
Okay. And then what you just did when you went to the marketplace, you grabbed the D. All of this is free.
It is, yeah. It's free and
so
open
I
source.
can use the concepts from ggplot and have a higher performing, better rendering method of showing what I want to show using that.
In short, yes. So
Okay.
the reason
Thanks.
many
I
reasons,
appreciate the catch up. I was just making sure I was
No, that's fine. I think it's a new concept we're bringing in. It's thinking differently to a lot of what you know about Power BI. So any questions are good questions because it helps to bridge the gap. The Vega and the Vega-Lite tooling is very well known, and it's very, very compatible with the technology Power BI runs on, which is why it was chosen. And it's very well maintained, and it's also something you can, much like R or Python, use outside of Power BI. So you could use Vega and Vega-Lite elsewhere. Likewise, you can find examples elsewhere and bring them in. So that's kind of the idea. The value Deneb brings is not just to bring those languages in, and as you say, it is kind of a wrapper. So it kind of puts those languages in, but it also builds a, which we'll show in just a sec. It builds a framework around it so that you can do work inside Power BI. But it also integrates some of the things in Power BI that are a lot of work in JavaScript to do. So Deneb takes care of a lot of that stuff. And that's where the value is. So what we'll do is we'll add Deneb to the canvas.
If you already know the concepts in ggplot for visualizations, then you can carry those things over to Deneb.
The thinking, yes, absolutely. If you know how to build a visual in ggplot, you should be able to think. Obviously, the language is slightly different, but the concepts are very, very similar.
Okay. This is awesome, by the way, Daniel.
Thank you.
I'm really impressed with this. I'm really excited. I'm really excited. Thank you.
Excuse me. So hopefully we'll continue the momentum. But I'm going to show you something very simple today, but hopefully very useful. And I'll show you some aspirational stuff afterwards, depending on how we go for time. We may be able to play a bit more, but we'll see. If we don't have time, I'll show you some other stuff just to show you where you can take it.
And by the way, Daniel, we don't have like a hard stop directly at the top of the hour. So if you need more time, go for it.
Yeah, I think I will do. So we'll see how we go. What I might do is for speed, I'll copy paste examples and talk about them. because I want to show you what we can do, but also I don't want to kind of whiz through it too quick, but we'll see where we go. So we add Deneb to the canvas, and it's just like any other Power BI visual, but it's a little bit different in terms of how you work with it. So the way I try and start with explaining it is think of Deneb like a table visual. So in that example, we showed you location and measure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my year month from my date table, which is a date field that is the first of the month. And I'm going to make it a table just to show you how it looks underneath. So I've basically got a date column, which is just the 1st of January 1927 and so on and so forth. I'm going to then add in my average temperature. And I can now see that Power BI will aggregate that. Now, moving that to a Deneb visual, we think the structure is exactly the same behind the scenes. So we think about the granularity a table gives us, and this influences our design decisions with our data set for Deneb. And there are some instructions here, but conceptually what you have to do is add your data. We then go into the visual header and go into what's known as the advanced editor. So not every visual has this, but there is an option exposed. If you've used visuals like Power KPI Matrix or Charticulator, you may have seen that as well. That allows us to open up a full screen as much as Power BI gives us. Unfortunately, we only have access to this part of the window, which is a shame, but it's the best we can do. But it opens up a new interface, and this allows us to create or import a spec. So people make template. Deneb, one of the things Deneb offers is the ability to export your work as a template. So people can import those from examples online, or we can create a new one. Today we're just going to create a new one, and there's not a lot of examples bundled because each example pushes the size of the visual up, but we've just got some really simple stuff to get started. I'm going to choose an empty visual, and I'm going to click create. And this is going to now give me my user interface. And because we're presenting, I'm just going to bump the font size up a little bit in the editor by clicking the right buttons. There we go. So we've got kind of 3 areas. We've got the JSON editor, which is where we will put our specification. We have the preview area, which is this part here, and we can see, hopefully it comes through well enough, but there's a little dotted area here, and this represents the visual space on the canvas. Now I can see there's a little bit of scroll space here. I can zoom that to fit within the boundaries, but I can see that my visual is a specific shape and size. Now, if I don't like the shape and size, we can't programmatically change that. That's something you have to change yourself on the canvas, but I'll just jump back out and resize that. Now we can see that's blank because we've created a new specification but not done anything. But I've just resized my visual slightly, so it's a slightly better. I might just make it a little bit wider. And if I jump back in, I can now see that this dotted line area has changed. And we'll just zoom that to be a little bit bigger. The bottom half of this side of the screen is what's called the debug pane. So this shows our visual data set, and we can see that we've got our year month field and our average temperature. But Deneb also provides the format string for a measure if you've supplied it at a row level, and also the formatted value. So if your data model has a format string, you can get the formatted value, or you can manually format it yourself. The reason this looks like this is because we have to have the raw value for Deneb to do the most work with it. If we were just to pull in formatted measure, that's a text value. We won't be able to do things like add or aggregate. So these are your base fields. You have your formatted fields, and we also have what's called the row number, and that helps us to just do things with interactivity if we need it. So it's there for info, can be used for other things, but right now it's not massively important. So what I would typically do, actually, before I start, there's one other thing. There's a line here that says data name data set. So what this is doing is saying link to the visual data set. Now, those examples we saw, let's just find the Vega-Lite one, we'd manually defined data. In Power BI, we don't necessarily want that because our data can change through slicing and dicing and various other things. So anything that's bound to this values bucket is linked to this data set declaration here. Underneath, we have a layer declaration, and that's just to say that we might put things in here. This is a blank template, so we're not going to worry about that at the moment. What we're going to do is think about building a visual by exploring it. So with our data, we've got our date time field, which is our first of the month every year. And we've got average temperature. And a common use case for data by time is a line chart. So that might be my intuitive way to visualize it. For time, I will just copy paste my example. So this is my Vega-Lite specification. My data set remains. I've added a line mark, and I've set an encoding channel for my X to be my year month field, and I've given it what's known as a type of temporal. So that's just saying for the X-axis, it's a date field. So that's just telling Vega-Lite that we don't want it to be categorical or linear. It needs to be treated as a date. With the Y-axis, we've bound our average temperature field, and it is known as what's called quantitative, which is linear or continuous, as we might call it in Power BI. I'm going to run that to apply my changes. And now we can see that Vega-Lite has drawn a line chart, and it's kind of auto-managed the axis, given it a title, and it's kind of worked out the distance, and it's put grid lines on, and we've got something that looks like a line chart, as we might expect with this volume of data. If I jump back out, I can resize that, and Deneb takes care of all of the things that we might have to do manually if we're building our own visual. So Vega-Lite actually does the axis density for us, but Deneb deals with the changes and handling all that stuff. But this is not a very useful chart in the sense we kind of know that over time things go up and down because of seasons, and it's very hard to read this chart. It's actually quite distracting. So this is where we start to think about the idea of how might we play with this to get something that actually looks more useful for a reader. So one thing we might do is change the encoding slightly. So what I might do instead for my X-axis is I might add what's called a time unit directive. So this is all in documentation. For time, we're just glossing over where we might find it. If I apply that change, it may not look much different, but what Vega-Lite's going to do under the hood is it's going to aggregate this data to a year for us. And you can see that's kind of weird because it doesn't quite match the grain underneath. But bear with me. What we'll then do is we'll think about changing the type of mark from a line to a rectangle. That's going to look more like a bar chart. It's still pretty noisy because it's ultimately got a lot of years in here and a lot of values. So what we want to try and do is decrease that clutter slightly. So for time, I'll copy paste this and replace my Y with the same field, this year month field, which is our date field. We'll use the time unit, but we'll use the month. And we'll specify its ordinal, which means it has an order. So a month, obviously, in alphabetical order doesn't make a lot of sense, but it has a chronological order. And this is something Vega-Lite will do to make sure that we get the order we expect. So if I apply my changes, I now get something that looks like a grid. It's got the month on the left, and it's got the year along the bottom, and I've got a place for each intersection of that data point. And this is all from 2 columns. So I haven't had to do anything with my data model. So often when you're customizing visuals in Power BI, you have to think about special measures or columns in the data model that are particularly just used for visuals. These kind of things help with mitigating that and keeping the model less noisy. And the other thing we'll do is we will apply a encoding to color, because squares don't really mean anything unless we can figure something out. So what we're saying here is now add the temperature field, and we'll make this a linear or quantitative field, just like a measure. So we'll apply this, and now we can see Vega-Lite, I should say, has assigned colors based on a ramp from minimum to maximum. So we can see quite quickly the coldest stuff is across here, but we can sort of see our seasonality and our data over time in a much more info-dense way than a line chart that we just can't read.
Daniel, I have to say that I love this chart. And one of the things that frustrated me for a while is like learning how and when the legend appears.
Absolutely.
I was like, wait a second, I just made this change, now I get a legend. I've just made this other change and now the legend's gone. What happened?
And if you don't like, if you don't like a legend, you can just turn it off. Oops, sorry, make it empty. You might not want that. So there are the declarative nature allows you to start customizing parts of it, which is quite nice. I'm going to leave it on for now. One other thing we can do is we can give it a slightly more natural color scheme. So that we have inbuilt schemes. Vega-Lite and Vega have a whole bunch of them. We also bind the Power BI themes, which is covered on the Deneb website. So if you've got, if you're using theming, we actually link all the theme types to Deneb as well. So let's use a blue-orange so we can see what's cold and what's hot. Well, we can see, again, we just assign that in there, and it does the work for us. The one other thing we can do is this kind of defines our directives. We have another option called config here, and we can think of config like styling. So what we can do is we can put in directives like remove the stroke from the view, which we can't see at the minute. It's a rectangle that Vega puts around for some reason. Change the font to single UI, which is the Power BI font. Take the title off the axis, remove things from the axis, change the padding, and just apply those. And we can see now we get, a bit less clutter on the chart. We don't need those titles because we know what a month and a year is. So we can apply cosmetic changes. We can do it in the specification tab, but the config tab lets us keep it separate. So we can separate our logic from our styling, which is quite a neat little feature as well. So one thing that's really neat about this is we get the info density, but it's still year and month granularity. We have a date table that has daily grain, but to do daily grain is going to be really, really crazy. So one of the things we can do here is think about I've got a tooltip page, which is going to give me a daily measure. So right now it's quite busy because there's no context, but I can build a page and I could then bind a tooltip to it. So I go to my visual. So I mean, just based on the next question, I guess we can see that Deneb came up pretty quickly when the page refreshed. It didn't take 4 or 5 seconds like an R visual could take. So custom visuals do have a slight delay, but it's as quick as we can get it. So I'm in my visual. I hover over a data point and nothing's really happening. If I go to my settings tab, I can see there's a section here called Vega Power BI Interactivity. So this is a lot of stuff that Deneb handles on your behalf and does the talking to Power BI for you. We can see that we do have tooltip handler highlighted, but we still don't have a tooltip. And this is one of the first pitfalls of tooling when you build your own visual, is it's up to you to define when a tooltip is displayed, because not everything on a chart should display a tooltip. So you don't want to be spamming people with tooltips the whole time. In this case, we have one mark, and all we would really do is just add tooltip true. And now, if we hover over a data point, Vega-Lite's sending a signal to Deneb, Deneb is delegating to Power BI, and we're getting the tooltips come up. So I can now see that for this month, I've got a daily breakdown of my temperature, but I can see my min max span and my ranges throughout each day. And that will kind of work as
Daniel,
we go.
You still work as a Power BI consultant for customers,
I do.
right? What percentage of your reports do you use Deneb versus any of the other visuals that?
It's a good question, because I guess my consultancy work splits into 2 halves. The half that essentially people engage with me to just produce Deneb visuals for them. So in that case, it's 100%. In the other half, where people are actually having me build solutions, some of those orgs don't allow custom visuals at all. So we have to work with core visuals, and often we will work with. It's really about choosing the right thing. We do a fair bit of Deneb visuals. So I work mostly with an environmental agency over here in this part of the world, where a lot of what we do, those visuals don't exist in Power BI. The whole industry, there's a whole bunch of visuals that are just not possible to build. They're standard visuals. They're de facto because people have understood them for decades, but they're very niche. So often we get approached specifically to help build solutions in Power BI that include visuals they need using tools like Deneb. And that helps them adopt Power BI. And that's generally a problem with specific industries. I've helped power companies with similar challenges where they've got visuals that they use to show certain things that just can't be done. And they were building them in Excel, and they were not moving to Power BI because of these kind of limitations. So what we're able to do is use Deneb to build last holdout visuals, for lack of a better word, in Power BI and allow them to see all their data in one place. So in terms of the regular Power BI work, and it's a bit of a weird question in how I can answer it, because I sometimes deliberately favor jobs that still get me doing data transformation and modeling because I want to keep those skills.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a tricky one, but more than you would think is probably the answer. I get a lot of referrals. I get a lot of people asking to do one specific thing well, using
like
Deneb.
I've written against the Visual SDK the old way, and like you, I had customers ask for, a particular calendar visual so they could do utilization resourcing, or a particular way to look at a manufacturing line so that it mimicked what their software looked like,
Yep.
So we've done a lot of the old like Node.js, JavaScript visual work. And then we've also done a lot of ggplot and plotly work in Python and in R. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, it's rendering so quickly, which is the problem I've had with Python visuals in the past. Like, it renders so slowly. So this is rendering so quickly, and it's so awesome to code in. Like, you're just changing the JSON and you're immediately seeing the changes with the data that you have.
That's honestly, and again, I can sort of share a lot of, the SDK is really good because obviously Deneb's built with it. But that feedback loop with clients is really hard. Often, I guess just to share some anecdotal information, if people engage me to build a custom visual, which used to happen before I built Deneb, and still kind of happens now depending on the requirement, but there'd be a lot of time is needed. So it's not just building and developing, but it's feedback and iteration, and it's scoping. And
it's a software project.
It is. It is. People don't realize it is a software project. That's exactly right. So often we'll sort of say, people will say, "Oh, I just need this change. The bar chart doesn't do everything I need, but I need this one specific thing." And I said, "Well, I've got to build you the whole bar chart first."
Yeah,
but I can't take the core bar chart and change it because Microsoft don't make it available. I have to build my own bar chart exactly as you want it, and then incorporate those changes. So it can be, we can maybe do it in 12 hours, but we're going to probably do about 50 or 60 hours to get it exactly as you want it, and take for granted. With the Deneb visual, we can do it in a couple hours, and we can do it on a call, and we can do changes in real time. And we can build it for like a 20th of the cost and a 20th of the time, and it runs pretty well, and it's certified as well. Because the other challenge you've got with, I think I'd said at the beginning, if somebody wants me to build a visual for them, they want it to work in PDFs and all that kind of stuff, and it's, well, sorry, we've got to submit it to app source. Oh, we don't want to know, we don't want people to know this visual exists. There's a whole lot of challenges with that. So this has been born out of some of my challenges as a consultant, but also the other thing is the HTML visual taught me that people can do some amazing stuff when you give them a tool with the flexibility in it. And Deneb has been no different. And I'll show you some of the stuff shortly that people are doing that just blows me away. I couldn't even imagine the kind of stuff that people are building, and this is helping them.
Yeah, this is awesome. Just to let you know, and I'd hate to put you on the spot publicly. You can tell me you'll talk to me offline, but Tim and I are writing a book called Storytelling with Data Using Power BI, and we have a chapter about custom visuals, and I think we're going to scrap the agenda for that chapter and just do Deneb, honestly. Like,
it's really cool.
Come on, Ike.
I think we are. I think we'll just cover Deneb in it. I think there's no reason not to. It's just so valuable. And yeah, Daniel, if you want to help us for credit, there's no money in writing books, but there's only pride.
Let's chat a little bit offline. I think for me to commit to doing anything else at the minute would be challenging because then it takes a lot of my time. But I'd be very happy to, if there's things you need to know, or we can talk a lot about that. It's an exciting prospect. The book sounds like a great idea, and it's really flattering that you're thinking about doing that. Thank you.
Oh,
I already hit him up earlier.
Okay. All right. No, I haven't been in a session this impressive in a long time, Daniel.
Oh, thank you.
Phenomenally cool. Yeah.
Let's hopefully try and keep the momentum going with continuing to impress you. I hope. Let's see what we can do. So the last couple of things I'll do very quickly with this demo is talk a little bit more about the interactivity we assume visuals should have, and that's cross-filtering and cross-highlighting. So this is why my other visuals are on the page. So I've got this bar chart here, and I can click on the data point here, and I can see it will filter my Deneb visual, and that's taken for granted. This Power BI will deal with that. It reduces the data set and sends it to the visual, so Deneb just adapts. We can't do the same thing with Deneb out of the box. And again, the reason is because you have to then think about the experience and what it means for your users. But we do give you the tooling. So firstly, if I go back to my settings page, I've got two options down here: expose, cross highlight, which we'll talk about second, and cross filtering of data points. So if I click on cross filtering, we saw a little update down here. And what's happened is Deneb has added an extra column called selected. And this currently says neutral. And what this is to do is to track the state of cross-filtering for you. So what basically happens is you click on something and then you need to be able to encode it, and you need to be able to manage it. So this selected column helps you do that. So if we click on this top data point, we can see nothing's changed. But we can see down the bottom, selected now says on, and the rest say off. So this field has three states: on, off, and neutral. So it allows you to be very prescriptive about the visual effects your visual can do. But we can see it hasn't dimmed anything out. And again, that's because your design might do things that other visuals don't do, or you might have to think about what that means. So just because this is a standard rectangle and you might want to dim the others out doesn't mean that a design you come up with shouldn't do something else. So you just have to think a little bit about what I want to do. So in this case, I want to dim everything that isn't currently the focus of cross-filtering. And the way I can do that is through the encoding channels. And I'll just add one in here called opacity. Let's just collapse these down. So with opacity, we're saying, so opacity is how solid a mark is. Vega and Vega-Lite have conditions. So we think of these as if else, and they have Boolean logic as well, so and, or, and not. We can put a test in to say if the selected field is off, then set the opacity value to 0.1 or 10%. So theoretically, when we apply this, anything that's off should be dimmed out. But otherwise, it should be 1 or 100%. So that means if it's neutral or on, or some other value we never thought about that Deneb might put in later, it will always be solid. And if I apply this change, I can now see that my data point has remained solid, but all my others are dimmed out. So my user now knows which one is the focus of cross-filtering. So if I jump back, I can see that my bar chart has been cross-highlighted, and I can click around and I can see that that's going to work. And I can shift click or control click. Actually, shift click's coming in 1.7. Control click, and we can see the bar chart is being managed by Power BI. And I can click my background to remove my selection, and that's all fine. The next thing is cross highlight. So we see this in the bar chart when we click a data point, and what Power BI does is it keeps the original bars in context, and it puts a new solid bar with a new value in front. And so what this means is there's actually two rectangles. And now for our visual, we're probably not going to do that because it's either going to be dimmed or it's not. But in another design, we might have to think about adding more marks. We're not going to do that today. But we are going to think about what happens if I click my visual. And so I've clicked July, but it's just hard filtering right now. So for me to change that, I'll go to my settings pane and I'll click expose cross highlight values. And again, we got a little update in the data view. And we've now got some new fields. Average temperature highlight status, excuse me, an average temperature highlight comparator. So what these are doing, Power BI sends us the original measure, but it also sends us what's known as highlights to say, here's the new values based on what's happening on the page. And we can see everything is blank except for this one. So what it's basically saying is this is July's value for that year, and that has a value. And we can see that this is equal to that value. So we've got the comparator that kind of says, you know, it's the same or different. These are less than or not equal to. So we can either look at the number or the comparators that we offer, or the status that tells us it's on or not or off. All I'm going to do is very simply do a comparison between the highlight value and the temperature and style that element accordingly. And that just requires me to add one more condition. I should say test to my condition. So let me just, for time, copy paste, replace that opacity. And what I've done is I've added an or to say the following two could be valid. So I've got my selected field is equal to off, which is before. What I've done with the second one is I've used what's known as the expression language. So Vega and Vega-Lite have an expression language, which is kind of like JavaScript. It's a lot more sanitized because certainly certified visuals can't do generic JavaScript, but it's a JavaScript-like language that allows you to do things more complex than the JSON can offer. So in this case, I'm just doing a standard, the temperature isn't equal to the highlight value, which is just a way of saying, if these are different, it falls into this. And if I apply that change, my July is now highlighted. So I can go back, I can click on different ones. I can see my original data in context. I can multi-select, and I've now got my cross-highlighting working. So these are kind of the 4 key areas of interactivity. We also have context menu support. We don't have a drill through page, but that would appear if we right-clicked on a mark. So Deneb does its best to resolve as much of that as possible for you. In terms of things you can do, I know we've done something really, really simple today, but it hopefully shows some of the capabilities. As I say, on Deneb's page, we've got a community, on Deneb's site, I should say, we've got a community and resources page where people are sharing what they're doing. So Deneb's been out now for about 2.5 years in AppSource, and it's been in public preview. It went into public preview about 3 years ago. So Kerry has been there from the beginning. She's done some amazing examples. Let's just open this up, and hopefully I can get a page because the Teams thing is in the way. So Kerry shares a lot of her discoveries in Deneb and explains how they work and shares templates. One thing that really stood out at the beginning was Kerry's experiments with prototyping, using the same data, producing different outputs. And these are available in the sample workbook. So you can have a look and see just how far you can go. And what's also really cool is she's integrating DAX plus JSON. So you can make measures that integrate with normal parts of the visual, and this background changes color based on a threshold. So you can actually mix and match DAX as well, which is quite cool. We've got Andre, who uses Vega, which is the more advanced one, but he produces some incredibly detailed. So this is one visual. So it's got 2 visuals joined together, but it's an interactive chart. Same with this one. We've got faceting. So world population structure, adults, children, and elderly over time. The infamous COVID spiral that was done in Vega. What's really amazing, and it's a shame Publish to Web doesn't do different shapes, is this population pyramid where he's integrated slices and various other things, but we can see this really quite powerful visual that shows, breakdown of male and female over time plus forecast. Neat ideas where we take a standard bar chart and put a tiny little heat map underneath where we compare 2 variables in a small space. Box plots, more small multiples with spark lines, these kind of things. The folks at Datavogue, Alexandra and Joanna, they do some amazing examples, including IBCS type visuals, and lots of storytelling type designs. So these two are really worth following. David Batchy, he's really pushing what's possible. So he's producing chart. These are all Power BI charts using Vega and Vega-Lite, but he's done a animated bank failures chart, which uses packing and clustering, a calendar heat map, convex hull clustering, storytelling again, coronation of British kings over time, and things like that. Even some mapping is possible, animated stuff. So this is just a scatter plot that uses time series to animate without any interaction from the user. Force-directed graphs, so showing complex relationships. This Gantt chart is probably one of the most impressive things I've seen, and he's done even more with it. Infographic style bar charts, Marimekko charts, a very cool tree chart. Again, more storytelling. The Parliament chart was a nice example. The animated bee swarm charts. He's even managed to get a Sankey chart working, which is supposedly not even possible. Madison's another person who's pushing as well. This is one visual, fully interactive, where you can go around the outside and it will highlight things inside the chart. Serpentine timeline, so displaying a sort of non-conventional timeline in a more condensed space. Lots of interactivity. Worth visiting these properly, seeing how they work. Amazing stuff. My one contribution outside
and
of
these are
the
all
tool,
done in, these are all Vega
Yep.
influencers. Oh, okay, great.
Yes, and a lot of these people have actually pushed examples back to Vega and Vega-Lite. So if we look here under the Vega examples, the packed bubble chart's one of Madison's. The serpentine timeline we talked about, he's pushed that back. So not only are they contributing to Power BI, they're contributing to the ecosystem as well. But they make all their work available as templates, so you can download them and put them into Power BI, into Deneb using Power BI. Power BI using Deneb. Jeez, I get my words right.
I'm a little fuzzy on Vega. Is Vega, so I understand how the people are creating visuals, but is the Vega platform specifically for the web?
It's built for the web, yeah, but there are other technologies that take Vega and implement it. So Altair, which is a Python library, that's built on Vega.
Is there, and what's the JavaScript version? Is Vega the
Vega.
JavaScript version?
Yeah,
Okay,
Vega was where it began.
So
wasn't Vega a derivative of D3?
Think of it as a stack. So you have JavaScript. D3 sits on top of JavaScript and makes some of the pain points of building charts in JavaScript and other data-based documents easier. Vega is a JSON wrapper for a lot of D3. So Vega kind of orchestrates D3 in a more graphical, like grammar of graphics way. And then Vega-Lite sits on top of Vega. So think of it as a stack. Vega is kind of the highest point, and Vega will compile to Vega-Lite. Sorry, Vega-Lite will compile to Vega, and Vega compiles down to JavaScript.
Do you have any experience with any of the other JavaScript libraries like Victory or like Charts.js, or there's like a dozen others?
Yeah, quite a few. Yeah, quite a few.
And do you feel like
eCharts, and there are eCharts. I think somebody's working on an eCharts visual for Power BI, and there's a Plotly.js visual as well. So there are visuals out there that are more kind of graphical, I guess, in that regard.
More graphical, right? Yeah, more. That's how I would describe Victory.
More of an interface for building charts.
Right. More of an interface for building charts, right? But engineers don't care about that. Like engineers are fine with the JSON interface, and
a lot of the rationale for JSON is to do with the kind of restrictions that Microsoft have for certification. So with JSON, it's parsable, it's very hard to abuse, and it's very easy to sanitize. So if you put like a JavaScript chart library into a custom visual, you're not allowed to execute arbitrary JavaScript inside a custom visual and have it certified, because there's all kinds of security problems that causes. So Vega and Vega-Lite are very, very secure, but they're also very, very well positioned for the kind of challenges that organizations that only allow certified visuals can work with.
Yeah. So would you, I know this isn't the topic you're speaking on, but if you were working with a software company and they were looking at JavaScript visual options for engineers to implement, would you recommend Vega over the others, including D3 and Charts.js? And
I think the short answer is it depends. I personally do, but that may be skewed by my experience. But I know it's very easy to spin it up, and I don't have to worry about a lot of things. But likewise, I've used high charts. So I've built visual solutions with high charts because that's what the development teams knew. So sometimes if you're working with in-house development teams, you got to look at what do they know, what's the easiest maintenance for them. So if I'm handing a visual over, if they've already got a particular, knowledge set, it's just like working with a team that uses React or Angular. If that's what they prefer, sometimes it makes sense to take that path. The reason as I say, the reason I choose Vega and Vega-Lite is because its language is good. It solves a lot of the challenges that we have with certified visuals, but also
and it uses a
the
lot
APIs,
of the same notions as ggplot and the other
exactly. It's very easy to
things
put
that they might have known already, particularly if they might have an analytic background. And I'm selfishly asking you this because I have a customer right now that's asking me for recommendations, and I'm looking at this like, if they want my recommendation, if they ask me to implement it, I would like to implement it in Vega.
Generally, we find the easiest way to do it. And the last point I was just going to mention was Vega has what's called a view API. So that's the display of the visual. The part that displays it is quite extensible. So like we add in custom things like formatting, for instance. Vega has its own built-in formatting using D3 style. But obviously with us being Power BI folks, Power BI has its own custom formatting language. So we can actually just integrate that in. So if you want to use Power BI format strings, you can. You just have to specify you're using the Power BI formatter as in your grammar. And then you can just format numbers like you do with Power BI format strings. And we're actually going to beef that up a little bit in the next version, hopefully, with auto formatting, which we kind of take for granted. So there's quite a few things that we can do. So that's one such thing we do. But a lot of the interactivity is handled in a similar manner. So you can actually build logic in. The tooltip is the same way. They're quite good at extensibility, which is another great thing for me because it lets me focus on features rather than problems.
Daniel? I just think this is awesome, Daniel. Like I have a team of data scientists that are forced to work in Power BI and they hate it. And I love Power BI. I'm not, insulting the platform, but the data scientists are just used to so much more control over their visuals, and they are just used to data frames. And I think
Power BI is very, we have some limitations with Deneb, but Power BI it's designed in a very specific way to put data in a very specific way, which isn't massively data science friendly, but you can still do some things with Deneb that you couldn't do with a visual that has predefined roles for certain things. So
yeah, I think they're going to love this. I think they're absolutely going to love it.
I hope they do. We get a lot of feedback on that.
I have a quick question, and this is a selfish question on my part, but I think the community will appreciate this. Do you have any debugging tips? Because I noticed that once my JSON gets a little bit hairy and gets pretty layered, if I make one small mistake, sometimes it goes south on me.
Yeah, so one of the challenges this is a slightly longer answer. You can mess part of it up. I've just removed the comma and I've got a little indicator here that there's an error. If I run my spec, I get logs. But that's not it kind of helps, but it kind of doesn't. So one of the things I've done with Deneb is because it's just a whole bunch of technical challenges one after the other. So a lot of what I'm doing since it went live is building better experiences. So it's not easy to find those errors currently. And this component here is an editor that I used to save me some time. So what I can do very quickly, if that's okay, is I can show you, I've got 1.7, which is the version that's coming in about, well, I don't want to put a timeline on it, but it's nearly ready to be beta tested.
Okay.
And this is going to put in a lot of extra stuff that will help with that kind of stuff. So hopefully the demo gods will be kind. So the editor's a little bit different, but not massively. But one of the key things now is if I delete the comma, I'll start to, it will highlight where things are starting to go wrong. So I can immediately see, and also, so if I've got a place where it says a comma is expected, so I can whack that comma back in and it's going to work. If I do something a bit more destructive, it's going to light up a bit more, but it'll start to show you almost like a call stack of where your problems are starting to come from. So yeah, that's going to hopefully help with a lot of the debugging problems that we have. And obviously, if once we've got over that bar, if there's more things we can do, the best thing I can suggest is, Deneb's GitHub repository is open. If you have any feature requests or bugs, just create an issue. And I will do my best to find time to address them or see if we can schedule something in that can improve it. So a lot of the challenges with Deneb is just doing things in a custom visual that they're not really able to do. So the editor has been a huge problem, and I'm starting to get over some of those hurdles now. So things like auto completion isn't great, but it's going to get better in 1.7. We actually get the Vega-Lite language stuff now. So no more guessing what comes. You'll be able to actually find the keywords that work in various places in the JSON. If you want to know more about what things do, we get the online, sorry, not the online, but the inline documentation will now come up. So you can actually learn more as you work rather than having to go out to the documentation site all the time. So there's these little quality of life enhancements that there's a lot of them in 1.7. These are just two that we've just talked about. But yeah, so debugging and finding your way around is going to be a lot easier.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's been times where I have created a layer and there's been some question on where the data came from. So I guess I should check out the logs.
Yeah, I mean, I try my best to keep, one of the things that frustrates me, I have to do a lot of things. I have to develop and run a project and be, I'm the developer, I'm the document writer, I'm taking a lot of stuff on. But one of the things that's really important to me is documentation. So I do keep Deneb's site up to date. One thing I would suggest is the version I'm working on is usually there on the site. It's just not the active version, but you can click on, as I drop features into the builds, they don't get released. When it gets released, I'll make it an official version. But if you ever download alpha builds, so each time a change gets merged into the main branch, people can adopt that version. It's not certified, it's not part of app source, but you can start testing and feeding back on features. Every time a feature comes in, I will do my best to at least get something in the change log. So the 1.7 change log is already quite busy, as you can see. So we keep Vega up to date with each release, but we're going to have commenting support in 1.7, so you'll be able to actually comment your JSON, whether it's for debugging or for documenting, which has been a long-awaited thing. Auto completion, the inline documentation we just saw, the improved highlighting we just saw, code folding preservation, which is another pain we've currently got. That's going to be massively improved. Better keyboard navigation. Dark mode is another thing. So you'll be able to toggle. I don't think that's in this build, but it just got pushed. Yeah, it will be here in the top right. There'll be a button and a keyboard shortcut you can use to toggle the dark theme and the light theme. And what we call advanced cross filtering. If you use Vega, that's going to be very interesting to see how people use that. And if we can get it working well, we'll hopefully be able to get Vega-Lite doing some stuff with it. And then there's various other little things. But yeah, every feature that goes in, I try and give it a decent amount of focus in terms of people that are adopting it. What do you need to know? So it's always worth keeping an eye on these pages and put a watch on the GitHub repository if you're keen to stay on the bleeding edge. And in the community and resources page, we have an early access builds page that talks to you all about what the alpha and beta streams are, how to download them, how to feedback on them. because ultimately I'm at the mercy, you know, I can't test everything. So a lot of the community are quite good at picking up releases and giving me good feedback. And I rely very heavily on people to let me know about quality issues before I submit to app source, because once it goes to app source, there's a very long time frame to get it through to be approved. And if there's a bug in there, it can take 4 or 5 weeks, even if it's a tiny quick fix to get through to reports. So it's really, really important to detect early, particularly with app source publication. So yeah, I kind of rambled on a bit there, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea.
I think
has
this is
been great.
awesome. I think, Daniel, this is phenomenally cool. And I don't know how much help Tim and I can be, but we will definitely proselyte it in our book.
Thank you.
And we'll post this on our channel. And our channel is getting a little bit of traction. So maybe a few hundred people will watch it, maybe 1,000, who knows?
Oh, any extra person watching this is an extra person that's hopefully inspired to do more in Power BI. So I think, as I said, I might have said on the call, I can't remember, but you know, I don't have sales and marketing. It's me. I'm very dependent on the community and what they can do to show what's possible and to show me what's possible as well. I'm learning a lot from people's work, and they're feeding back into Deneb and making it better. So I would just encourage people to try it and explore it and see if it works for them. And if it does, I'd love to hear about how you're getting on. And if there's ideas, yeah, like I say, the GitHub repository is a fantastic place to get discussion going with other people. It's not the busiest of places, but some of the power users are there and they can add weight or discuss an idea as well. So what I try and do is, if people have feature requests, I try to think really hard about the product, but also ask what people want to see with a feature as well. So there's nothing commercially sensitive in Deneb. So